Let's talk about conditionals and wishes now. Talked a lot about other verb tenses in English, present, simple, future, past, perfects, progressives, all those kinds of things. We've talked about gerunds and infinitives, and conditionals are quite a different type of verb tense. They seem really similar to a lot of verb tenses that we've already talked about, but there are some major differences. Conditionals follow the pattern of if, then. So if something happens, then you get a particular result. Conditionals are used to express what we call a feeling of speculation. To speculate about something means to imagine what will or what would happen. So basically, conditionals allow you to make a guess about the present or the future or the past. The grammar of conditionals is not the same as other structures in English. The verb tenses change depending on what kind of conditional you are using and if you're talking about the present, the past, or the future. And in fact, some verb tenses don't really make sense logically in conditionals. Just know that this grammar is very old. It hasn't changed in the same way as some other grammar in English has changed. And you have to let go a little bit of what you already know about verb tenses in English in order to correctly use conditionals, because there are times when we are talking about the present, but we used past tense forms. And there are times when we are talking about the future and we use past tense forms. It doesn't necessarily mean that we're talking about the past, it just means we're using that form of the verb. There are 4 types of conditionals. One is the real or factual conditional for the present. The other is the real or factual conditional for the future. We have the unreal future conditional and the unreal past conditional, and we're going to talk about each one of those. First, let's talk about the real conditional for the present. Real conditionals are pretty simple. They use both the simple present tense in the conditional clause, meaning the if clause, and the independent clause, which is also sometimes called the result clause. Real conditionals are conditions of fact. They are always true. You always get the same result when your condition is met. For example, if water freezes, it turns to ice. Freezes, simple present, turns, simple present. So basically what this is saying is that every time water freezes, it turns to ice. You always get the same result, ice, when you get the condition of water freezing. Sometimes we do use other structures besides the if clause. For example, we can also use unless. Unless is kind of like the negative if. Unless means except if one condition is met. In every other situation, you get one result, but not when one thing happens. The team practices every day unless it rains. Every other time the team practices except if it's raining. You can also use when instead of if to make the condition sound more regular, more like a routine that happens all the time. For example, when I have a day off from work, I go to the beach. This makes it sound like I often have a day off from work. Using if would change the meaning. If I have a day off from work, I go to the beach. That makes it sound like I don't have a day off very often. Now let's talk about the real conditional for the future. The real conditional for the future also uses simple present tense in the conditional clause, the if clause. However, the result clause can have a variety of forms, but all of those forms somehow express the future. Some examples might be will, can, should, might, be going to, but remember that all of these are always followed by the base form of the verb, the simple form of the verb. Future real conditionals make a prediction about the future or express possibilities. These are real possibilities, which is why we call this the real conditional. If I pass the class, I will be very happy, right? There's a real possibility of me passing the class, and the result will be that I'm happy. The game will be played unless it rains. Notice in the conditional clause, if I pass, unless it rains, I'm using simple present tense. And then in the result clause, I will be happy, the game will be played, I'm using future tense. The next type of conditional is the unreal conditional for the present or future. This can be used for the present, but most of the time we use this conditional to talk about the future. This is where things start to get a little unclear or a little tricky because even though we're talking about the future, we use the simple past tense in the conditional clause. It's not to say that we're talking about the past, we're just using that form of the verb to express the conditional. In the result clause, you use would, could, should, or might, plus the base form of the verb, or the simple form of the verb. Present or future unreal conditionals speculate about the future, but unlike the real conditional, these situations are very unlikely or practically impossible for the situations to happen. If I had time off, I would take a vacation. But the reality is that I don't have time off, and I probably won't get any time off, which is why I'm using simple past if I had time off, and would. I would take a vacation, because this is my prediction for the future, but my prediction is not very likely to come true. Or the lottery, right? It's not a very good chance that someone will win the lottery, so he would quit his job if he won the lottery, but the chances of him winning are very small. Think about it like this, the difference between the real and the unreal future conditional. The real conditional is something that you think is a likely possibility. If we win the game, we will celebrate. On the other hand, the real conditional is something you think is nearly impossible. If we won the game, we would celebrate. So in the first example, win the game, using simple present tense here, I'm using the real conditional, and I think that there is a good chance that this will happen. In the other example, won the game, this tells me that there's a very small chance or no chance that this possibility will happen. The unreal conditional for the present or future also does something strange with the be verb. The way we use to be in conditionals changes. In hypothetical or speculative statements, we use were in place of was for all subjects. So I say, if he were here right now, he would help us. I don't say if he was here. I say if he were here. Same thing with I. Normally we use was when the subject is I, but in the conditional I say, if I were rich, I would buy a big house. There's also a difference in meaning between using could or would in the result clause. Compare these. If I had enough money, I would buy a car. If I had enough money, I could buy a car. In the first example, I would buy a car. That's definitely the action that I would take. In the second one, I could buy a car. That's one of the options that I have, but there might be more possibilities. Maybe I could buy a boat, or maybe I could buy a motorcycle. There's a lot of different possibilities with that. And finally, the unreal conditional for the past. You use past perfect, so had plus the past participle in the conditional clause. And you use would have, could have, should have, or might have, so a past modal. And then your main verb takes the past participle form in the result clause. I call this one the time machine conditional because the past unreal conditional speculates about the past. And because the past has already happened, and we can't go back and change things, the statement is always untrue according to what actually happened. But if you had a time machine and you could go back and change things, how would you do things differently? That's what this conditional is about. For example, if the students had studied more, they would have passed the exam. But the truth is that they didn't study more and they didn't pass the exam. Had studied, past perfect in my conditional clause, and would have passed, would have plus the past participle form in my result clause. Another example, I wouldn't have broken my arm if I hadn't slipped on the stairs. But the truth is, I did slip on the stairs. I did break my arm. Again, there's a difference in the meaning of would and could in the result clause. If he had had enough money, he would have bought a car. If he had had enough money, he could have bought a car. And no, that's not a mistake. It actually is had together. I know some of you are probably wondering about that. Remember that had in past perfect is the helping verb, and the past participle form of the verb have is had. So you actually can have had the helping verb and had the past participle form together. The difference here in the first one, he would have bought a car, is that that's definitely the action he would have taken. He could have bought a car. That's one of many possible actions he can take. When you make a wish, you are also speculating or imagining a different future, present, or past. Therefore, you also use a conditional verb to reflect this idea in wishes. For a future wish, use would in the dependent clause. I wish you would help me tomorrow. For a present wish, use the past tense. I wish I knew how to speak Japanese. So in this moment, I wish I knew how to speak Japanese. For a past wish, use had plus the past participle. I wish I had stayed home today. I don't feel well. If you have any questions, we can talk about those in class next week. Otherwise, there is a practice sheet with an answer key up on D2L, so please take a look at that. There's also some links to additional practice exercises up on D2L.